The passion, the energy, the power, the spirit of hardcore.
Hi, I especially enjoyed the previous talk. That was very inspiring, and I'm very happy to come here. This is probably my favorite conference that I come to every year. I mean, all things do end, but this has been great for the last few years that I've been coming, and obviously looking forward to what's coming in the future. Okay, so this is welcome to hardcore mode. This is from gaming where there were difficulty levels of easy, medium, hard, and then hardcore, where different rules apply. And I'm going to use that as a metaphor for how computer security works and doesn't work today in practice, and how we can both be inspired by some things that are that have happened already, some things that are yet to happen, some things that are currently happening. Just as a background on why I know about any of this stuff, like I did some sort of crazy things. I found this cypherpunk's mailing list back when I was like 12 or 13, back in the 1990s, and got on the internet really early, which was, I guess, the best thing possible that could have happened to me. But if you're a 12-year-old kid, you have no power over anything in the world anyway. So it's really very interesting to learn about technology where anybody who knows how to do this math in a certain way can build something that everyone in the world together for like tens of thousands of years together cannot defeat. So it's like a level of getting back at the rest of the world and being equal with them, or even better at certain things, that is available. It's very democratic, it's available to everyone, and was a very, very interesting thing. I then went on to, I went to MIT early. I dropped out of high school to go to college, and I wanted to build anonymous electronic cash more than anything in the world. Like anonymous electronic cash, Chaumian blinded tokens backed by physical assets. So like this is way before Bitcoin. This is, I think, actually before BitGold. It was around the time when like Hashcash, it was actually before Hashcash. It was David Chaum's blinded token stuff, which was pretty amazing. Unfortunately, he patented it in 1983 and wanted to only license it to central banks, which is, if you know anything about central banks, they are central and they are banks, but they are very, very slow to do anything at all, and they don't want to adopt new technology, so licensing it is kind of killing it. And so I tried to build this. I moved to a little Caribbean island. We did a gold-backed digital currency and all sorts of stuff like that. It ran into inevitable difficulties. Like hundreds of people have tried this before. Nobody's been successful yet. So there was that. And then I did this crazy project in the North Sea called Sealand Haven Co., where we built an offshore data haven in the middle of the North Sea on a World War II anti-aircraft fortress that the British had left there that declared itself a sovereign country. And it was pretty crazy. I was like 18, and we were on the cover of Wired magazine, and this is an image of me being hoisted from a boat that's like 80 feet down up onto this top of this deck. It was very not like health and safety compliant. And I did that for a while. Then I did something completely different, and as much as I respect Mitch's like anti-military stuff, I was also very anti-Iraq war at the time, but I had friends that were Iraqi expats, and they had moved to London in like the 70s and 80s. They really wanted to start an ISP in Baghdad after the US got rid of Saddam, because they were so convinced that like every Iraqi is going to move back to Iraq because it's going to be such a safe country, and they're going to get their country back, and they're going to build all sorts of stuff. So we were going to start the world's first peering exchange in Baghdad. And I moved there, and we did that for a little while, and then it turned into a complete crazy war zone as opposed to just sort of a post-occupation kind of thing while I was there. And I spent entirely too long, like 7 years or so, driving around in old 5 Series BMWs from base to base, setting up satellite internet for people, like for internet cafes, for the president, for various other people. So it was pretty crazy. Then I did a crypto VM startup, and we were doing like secure virtualization where you could do proof of what code is actually running in the VM remotely, like remote attestation, using this thing that came out before Intel SGX called Intel TXT. It was kind of cool, but it didn't really work very well, and Intel kept telling us like SGX is coming in like 2 months in the next version, and that lasted about 6 years. So I sold that company to Cloudflare once it was clear we weren't going to be able to ship fast enough, and did that for a while. So I got to see like the biggest DDoSes in the world, and that was pretty fun. Then I did a company doing like secure travel laptops, because if you go to China or Russia, even back in the mid 2000s, not even now, and you're like an interesting enough person, there's a whole range of stuff that happens to your laptop if you leave it unattended in a hotel room, ranging from maybe it gets booted and they image the drive to hardware implants. There was a famous attack that happened in, I think 2003 is when the actual attack happened, where hardware implants were applied to the laptops of corporate executives from RSA Secure ID. while they were in China, and they brought them back onto US networks, which then were used by a lot of US defense contractors, and it ended up causing lots of problems. So there's a history there, and the idea is we'd take like Chromebooks, and they'd be single trip Chromebooks. You'd take a Chromebook, you'd use it one trip, and then you'd dispose of it, and we'd X-ray it afterwards. The problem is the only people willing to really pay for this were crypto companies, so I ended up working with a bunch of crypto companies again, and joined a top 10 crypto foundation as CISO and board member. So it was pretty fun. And then I moved to Puerto Rico, this little island off of the US, and was mostly just investing in crypto projects and doing stuff. And I met some people doing insurance at Evertas, and they do a lot of really interesting security work as part of, like, incidental to doing the insurance side. And so I've been doing that for a couple of years. But the interesting common thread of all these is you get to see, or I've gotten to see, and I've gotten to talk about lots of the most difficult attacks that happen to things. I've done some consulting for a nuclear regulator. I've done some things like that, where I get to see a lot of the really well-resourced attackers, what they do to attack systems. And that's fairly interesting to me just from a technical perspective, but it's also a way to see in the future. And the problem is, like, we see lots of attacks. Like, doing anything on computers already is hard enough. Like, I don't know, you've got things that aren't even like security problems, they're more like safety problems, like the famous Therac 25, where this nuclear medicine device was misprogrammed and ended up like overcooking people and killed them back in the, I think, 60s. And it was one of the first failures of a computer control system that caused human fatalities, and was very sad. Then, of course, I fly a lot. I travel like probably 200 some days a year. I was flying from London to Puerto Rico via New York on the day that the CrowdStrike thing happened, where they shut down basically a lot of the airlines that I would normally be flying. I happened to be flying on like the one airline that was not affected by it, but it was kind of a fiasco. I showed up at the airport, and we were wondering why like none of the other flights were flying out, and that lasted for days. Certain airlines completely melted down. And then, of course, there's the perennial problem with like making printers work on your computer. So that's not a security problem, but it just shows how hard it is to do anything with computers. And then you add computer attacks, and there's a whole bunch of like low-hanging fruit that applies if you're a bad guy trying to compromise a computer system. You don't really need to go to extreme lengths to find some vulnerability. The sort of the best practice, if you're doing a lot of stuff now, is you get like a pen test done by some third party, and almost every pen tester will tell you it's not really a question of like if they're going to be successful, it's how long it'll take and exactly how interesting the finding will be. Part of the problem is if you find something really simple and you've charged somebody a reasonable amount of money to find it, they get really angry. It's like that famous joke about the famous, or the hardworking, like 40 years at the same plant guy comes in with a hammer and the system's not working, and they say, "Can you fix it?" He says, "It'll cost $30,000 for me to fix it," and they pay him because he's going to make this machine work, and he goes and he hits like one specific spot on the machine and it starts working again, and they're angry because it only took him like 10 seconds to do, and he says, and they say, "Whatever, we need an itemized invoice because that's way crazy," and he said like 40 years to learn where to hit and then like 10 seconds to hit. So it's sort of the same thing with computers. But you see a lot of problems that are caused by simple problems. So like most systems, it is crazy to put your effort into solving these like crazy, weird corner cases and futuristic things if you're not already handling all the table stake stuff. And almost every system that you see that's breached in practice today is breached through one of these sort of like table stakes things. I mean, phishing and social engineering are probably 50% plus of almost all attacks. And there's this theory that people had, maybe it was 5 years ago, maybe it was 10 years ago, that like sufficient user education will solve the problem of phishing. We're going to train all of our users by IT is going to either send out mail, or even funnier, pay third-party services to send out mail to all your employees, testing whether they're susceptible to like responding to mails or clicking on links to emails. It really does not solve any problems at all, and just shows that like if your entire system can be compromised by an employee clicking on a link in an email, that is probably not a problem with the employee, that is a problem with your system. And then the other biggest area, which is probably another like 25-30%, is credential related stuff, where either somebody uses the same password on every one of their systems, and they use like personal systems and work systems, and that personal system is some like website that gets compromised, and people then have a password list, or weak passwords, or all sorts of other stuff. But really, any situation where a user's login credential is subverted by a third party, then they gain what looks like legitimate access to the system. That's another like 25–30% of all compromises. And then you've got sort of the machine version of that, where you compromise one machine, pivot it to attack other machines, and some other things. So you've got like coding errors and things like that. But these are really sort of basic things, and we've known what they are, and there's lists of them published like every month, and everybody's always vulnerable to them, because while they're really simple, they're not easy to fix. It's like simple to enumerate what they are, but it is really a lot of work to eliminate every single one of these things and keep them eliminated. And what's really interesting is not so much these things, because those are common and they're kind of the default things. Like it's interesting to see them if it's your own system and you learn that there's something you can fix and everything else. But just knowing that like people have bad passwords, yes, once you know it, you don't really need to know every single system that has bad passwords. There's no real interesting predictive value there. It's just like universal thing. There are outliers that do exist in the space that are much more interesting, and they're usually outliers in different dimensions. So you've got something like Fort Knox that holds an incredible amount of value. Well, may hold an incredible amount of value. There has not been an audit of this in some time, but allegedly there is a lot of gold stored in this place, and it's in the middle of a military. The building itself is a fortress on a major military base. That's like the headquarters of the armored training group or whatever. So it's a very well-protected site, but it's also holding a lot of value. Then there's the problem of, so this is just Amazon. And there have been cases where systems that you wouldn't think of them as security systems, get used by attackers as part of a chain of attacks, and the weakest link might be some random person's like Amazon account, might be a customer service person at Amazon being willing to reset things. There was one attack, I forget exactly which one it was, where someone basically checked the validity of a credit card number and was able to replace a credit card number on an AWS account, because they were also linked to the AWS shopping account at the time for the president of the company. And by doing that, that was enough to then show ownership of the credit card number to recover the credential to the AWS account, which was then used to reset the root password to the AWS account, which was then used to compromise the system, which was then used to push code, which then compromised another system. So there's a whole chain of these things that happen, and they happen from really dumb origins. The most famous of these and most widespread of these is definitely the SIM takeover, like SIM swap attack, where, I mean, the phone company is in the business of selling you a cell phone. The salesperson specifically at the phone company is in the business of getting a commission for selling you a new cell phone. So they're not going to want to put a lot of effort into, this guy comes in, says, I just lost my cell phone, I need to buy this newest thing, and I need it by dinner because I want to show it off to my friends. Here's $1,500, and here's an extra $100 if you do it quickly. I need it added to my account because it's got my phone number, can you make this happen? And it happens. Or some cases they're in on the fraud and all sorts of stuff. But basically, when your phone number is used as a security credential, without the phone company agreeing that they're going to be used as a security credential by almost everybody, that creates a major problem. And then, of course, there's the like you can sort of do like an economically rational argument of, if you're protecting, like in the insurance company where I work, one of the guys that we work with also does like jewelry store stuff. So they would say you could put multi-million-dollar, like you could put like $1 million worth of jewelry in a safe that's got monitoring and 24/7 monitoring and a 5-minute police response time and everything else. And the attacker is probably not going to spend $10 million to steal that $1 million of value out of the safe. And it's pretty easy to evaluate like how much a piece of jewelry is worth. Like it's gold, it's diamonds, there's some like reasonable thing. There might be sentimental value, but it's generally a fairly predictable thing. So you can make a reasonable argument there. The problem is we have some forces in computer security that don't really exist in like the jewelry theft world. Nationalism is by far the current like biggest thing that is causing non-economic attacks. Like you have people that are, if you're a cryptocurrency company trying to hire somebody, you're going to get a lot of resumes from people that are going to be very, very qualified and very hardworking and very inexpensive. And they're probably not going to turn their camera on when they talk to you on the interview. Their English is not going to be excellent, but they're going to be really qualified, and it's going to be really tempting to hire them for like 30% less than market. But they're going to be from not South Korea. So they're So there's that problem, and that problem happens with all sorts of other countries too. I mean, the U.S. certainly does this. Other Middle Eastern countries do this to their adversaries. This is a standard thing that nations do, and then also countries do it. Like people that are pro a certain country but are not officially part of the security apparatus of the country will also participate in this kind of thing. So there's that. There's also just for the lulz. Like it is not an economically rational act to like deface a website, but people will do it for fun, and there are websites devoted to people who like to have fun and they do stuff. And then there are just like completely insane people like Goggins here who, while he's not a computer security person, would go to like the ends of the earth to do something just because he wants to. And those are sometimes your adversaries, and they're not like deterred by rational economic measures. And then there's the other thing, which is the unforgiving passage of time. Like this hard drive that was being loaded onto an aircraft from an airline that no longer exists is a 5 megabyte hard drive from IBM. And I think it was 40 years later, this 4 terabyte SD exists for like vastly cheaper. So if your attack is based on it being hard to exfiltrate large amounts of data because it's like physically bulky to move, that might have been a rational analysis at one point in time, is not a rational analysis for that same quantity of data today. And all sorts of other countermeasures are sort of like evolve over time in the same way. So it would be nice to not experience that in real time. Like it'd be nice to learn about these things in advance of them actually like biting you. And one of the guys over at A16Z Crypto, Chris Dixon, has this great quote that you can basically tell what's going to happen in the future by what people that are really smart are doing today recreationally. And that's one interesting way to view it. There's also a way to tell what routine attacks are going to be by what crazy, over-resourced, incredibly motivated attackers are doing today. So the future is great. We all want to live in the future. We're all getting there at basically the same rate, but the future would be nice. So we've got a bunch of incidents that were very interesting and very well-resourced attacks that are maybe illustrative of certain concepts in computer security that can be applied to some other things. This was from MAC-V-SOG, a special operations group in Vietnam, US forces, that did this thing called eldest son. They realized that their adversaries were leaving a bunch of weapons caches around, and they would send people in, MAC-V-SOG operators, they'd find these caches, and they could do something like they could just blow them up, they could take them, they could do whatever they want. That's sort of a linear kind of response. What they did is they took ammunition, they took like 1 round of ammunition out of a case of ammunition, and they made it an overproof round, so that if you fire this ammunition out of the weapon, it would kill the operator. And that obviously will kill one person, which is very, very bad for that person. However, it also completely shakes the faith of everyone else who's using that ammunition in that ammunition. So by replacing 1 round of ammunition, they convinced hundreds or thousands of people that have heard about this incident to not trust the stuff that's sitting there on the ground, which is pretty effective as a force multiplier, whether or not you believe in the conflict. Like I personally think most wars are bad, but this was a major thing. There have been several other more recent things. This is the best documented one because it's so long ago that there's a bunch of open source documentation about it. But during the Malvinas conflict between the British and the Argentinians, they were using French Exocet missiles, and there was a whole effort to basically make sure that those Exocet missiles that were being fired on British ships would not successfully be, like, the spare parts would be missing for them and all sorts of stuff like that. So there was a whole process of like infiltrating the supply chains there. The Soviet oil and gas industry had a whole bunch of parts that they were buying from Western companies through shell companies. Often those parts were replaced by parts that were not really to spec. Often if they had firmware, the firmware was not great. There was a whole effort that I think it's been relatively documented, but not incredibly well documented. The Soviets were buying, they were always sort of behind the West in buying, in making their own computer chips. They wanted to make computer chips. They were really amazing at like nuclear technology, aerospace, all sorts of other stuff. Surprisingly not very good ever at computer chips. So they would buy Western chips and try to like, what do you do if you can get like a small quantity of chips? You use them in your highest value systems, and you also try to reverse engineer them. So they would take these chips and reverse engineer them. And if you've ever tried to reverse engineer something that's a mass market consumer part, one of the things you rely on is that every one of those parts that you're getting is like a good part and is like relatively the same and things like that. So you can do a bunch of different like differential analysis and things. people would infiltrate the supply chain and give them like slightly bad parts that were bad in like weird ways. And they knew how they were going to try to reverse engineer them, and they made it really, really hard to work, and basically prevented the Soviets from creating a reverse engineered version of most of these chips. They were able to use some of them in production systems, but they weren't able to do anything really much better with them. Then there's the completely crazy thing, Howard Hughes, the guy who wanted to stay at a, like, was so antisocial. Like, I'm impressed. Like, I'm fairly antisocial usually. He is the most antisocial famous person ever. The guy who like wouldn't leave his room and had like the bottles and things. But he was staying at this hotel in Vegas and like wouldn't leave the hotel. They eventually wanted him to leave, so he just bought the hotel because, yeah. So this guy, but a famous guy, did a lot of stuff. The CIA wanted to, there was a Soviet submarine that had like sunk in the ocean, and they wanted to extract stuff from the submarine, both design and also potential code materials and everything else. So they realized they needed to build a big ship and like go and like recover the ship from the undersea and everything else. That's going to be a pretty big effort, and you can't really hide that, especially from the Soviets who are like actively monitoring. You could probably keep it hidden from the press because it's in the middle of the ocean, but your actual adversary would definitely be able to see it. So they created a whole crazy cover story that they're mining for magnesium nodules on the bottom of the ocean, built like multiple ships, were able to send them out there, recovered it, and then they created a cover story, or the public story is that they were successful in recovering the vessel, but it like broke apart while they were raising it, and it dropped down to the ocean again, so they weren't able to actually recover any of this information, which is exactly what they would say either if that had happened or if that hadn't happened. So like, who knows? But like, this is a crazy incident where they spent presumably billions of dollars in modern money on this project. And then of course we have, I would say the biggest, and like those are sort of sideshows. Like the eldest son was bad if you were like a Vietnamese soldier, and Glomar Explorer was bad if you were, I guess, the Strategic Rocket Forces guy from the Soviet Union, but it didn't really hurt anybody else. Then there was this that NSA did to basically everyone in the world and caused much bigger problems for everybody else. Basically a program of spying. Honestly, we were doing this in the 90s too, but it really kicked off with 9/11, Patriot Act. They all wanted to do this, but 9/11 was the justification for it. I mean, we're all very familiar with this, Snowden releasing this information, but it had been, like, honestly, all of the information was basically known somewhat publicly beforehand, just not documented in a way that could be cited. So the real value there was having citations and original source materials that could be used, but basically spying on everyone all the time, using weird, tortured legal definitions of what is spying and what is actually accessing materials versus collecting it and things like that. And this all happens. And this is a government that is allegedly a democratic government that I have paid taxes to and otherwise support. So yes. And then there's famous Stuxnet, where these people in a Middle Eastern country, Iran, were trying to build a bunch of centrifuges to refine nuclear materials for nuclear materials purposes, TBD, what they wanted to use them for. But they have all these centrifuges. These centrifuges are incredibly like finely balanced machines. And they're also, this is the biggest national security project for the country. So highly, highly good security, air gapped, everything else. And they did all sorts of crazy stuff where allegedly someone picked up a USB key and someone else dropped off something that reprogrammed the controllers in these things to run at like specific speeds at specific times in a way that caused damage, while also playing back other information that showed that nothing bad was happening. So it was able to happen over a period of time and basically caused catastrophic hardware damage to stuff through software remotely at the most secure site of a pretty major power, and did this. There have been a bunch of good books about it. I think the Kim Zetter book is probably the best book about it. And then in a more mundane world, there's like the Target hack, which is just an example of Target actually had relatively decent IT security for their own systems, but they had an HVAC contractor that had a system that had remote access to manage their air conditioners. And they got compromised and they used that to pivot to access. So it's just sort of an annoying thing. And then there's like the Ukraine, so there's people who think World War III started in 2014 and we're just like in the early stages of it still, but whatever. And this is part of the same conflict, the NotPetya attack, where a piece of malware was used to attack through an accounting package in Ukraine a bunch of people and caused a bunch of problems. And happened in a way, it was mostly detected because it caused incidental damage to a few other systems that were like a shipping logistics company, and just a scale of attack that was amazing. And then the most recent thing, where apparently pagers, if you make your battery in your pager out of like PETN, not really a great thing to keep on your belt. So a Middle Eastern country, possibly, well, targets in Lebanon, still not claimed by any particular country, but very plausible who it is, sent out, I think they made 5,000 pagers. There's been articles about this. So there were about 5,000 pagers that were made, about 3,000 distributed. They were a Taiwanese design that was manufactured in Hungary, or reworked in Hungary, distributed, and they all went bang with, I think, about 3 grams of PETN, like a decent explosive, all at the same time, like a week or two ago. And yeah, so there's a whole bunch of these scales of attacks. And what's the common element of these things? I mean, these are all crazy attacks that are like nation states, but they're examples of attackers that are not following rules. Like NSA, there's a very clear, like, you're not supposed to be spying on US people. They broke that rule. You're probably not supposed to blow people up in your neighboring country during a non-war situation, all sorts of things like these. So these are, like, they find rules that are both explicit rules and just people's assumptions, and they violate them. And then a lot of these attacks were super expensive. Like Glomar Explorer was certainly billions of dollars. Eldest Son was actually probably not that expensive. It was probably like tens of millions of dollars in operations. And then Stuxnet was huge, but the like the target attack was done by commercial attackers. So that was done with like hundreds of thousands of dollars, presumably, of budget. So different scales of attacks. These have been fairly targeted. They're not blanket attacks, but they've caused collateral damage to people. So the biggest collateral damage is probably NotPetya, because it did affect a bunch of other civilian companies that were not directly targeted. But this happens. And some of these things went on, like I think the pager thing they were saying has been like a 15-year project to have happen. And it is crazy that it all happened at the same time, but that. So some of these projects are very short, were comparatively short. Like I think probably the target thing was probably weeks to months of prep, whereas some of them are a decade. So there's that. And the other thing is none of these were like a single vulnerability. It was all a bunch of separate things that are all chained together in a sort of interesting way. So we can also easily look into the past by looking at the stars and seeing everything else. So we can look into the past. And there are some things about the past that are actually, those attacks are all fairly depressing if you're on the defense side. But there's some things that we've actually accomplished over the past, say, 20 years to make computer security meaningfully more secure. I was fortunate enough to be in computing in sort of insecurity in the 90s, so I have to see how hard it was to do most of the things that are actually quite easy to do today and are kind of defaults today. So like SSL TLS, transport encryption for everything, is the default. Like that has happened mostly as a result of a few factors. Like one, it got cheap to do. It used to require like a physical hardware accelerator to do RSA operations for SSL at like a reasonable speed. Like you could do like 10 per second on a PC, but in like the 90s, and now it's just trivial to do. And then Google started downranking people's search results if they didn't do it. And then obviously the Snowden thing was the main impetus for why end users demanded that this all be done. And I had the tiniest part in helping that happen when I was at Cloudflare. We made like SSL certs free for everyone. They used to be pretty expensive. And we worked with Let's Encrypt and other people to make it like super cheap. Data at rest, like almost everybody's phone is encrypted by default. Like the passphrase on your phone is used to create a key that's used to unlock your phone. So when your phone is completely off before first use, it's actually pretty robust against a lot of attacks. And that was certainly not the case. BitLocker and FileVault on Macs or PCs and Macs, and Lux and stuff on Linux are, if not default, like they are default on the consumer stuff, but if they're not default, they're pretty close to default and very easy to set up. It used to be like a multi-day fiasco where like a driver could make your machine unreadable and everything else. So a lot of that stuff is better. The biggest thing as a developer is now most software is actually developed in a memory-safe language. So it used to be like C and pointer craziness, and you just sort of assume buffer overflows are going to be found and everything. Now that's not the case, and most software is relatively safe against that kind of attack by default. And almost everybody's device has biometrics. It's sort of I mean, there was a period where like fingerprint readers and stuff were added to everything, but now that cameras are everywhere and you can do high quality video recognition and stuff, there's a lot of really high quality biometric analysis that's done on like devices by default. And patch management has been a huge pain historically. People would run, there was like specific versions of Android OS that were run primarily in China because they were like the last versions that you could run on certain devices that were major problems for everybody. Like it was why you couldn't upgrade SSL from like SSL 1 to SSL 2 for the longest time and things like that, and then beyond SSL 3. That's mostly like luckily now that everybody uses mobile devices as instead of computers, as one of the nice side effects of that is the batteries go bad fast enough that people will throw away their like $10 phone and buy another $20 phone like a few years later. So you don't usually have devices that are 15 years old in use now. You have devices that are like 5 to 10 years old, and that sort of puts a lifetime on stuff. And it's kind of crazy that corporations spend probably 5 to 20 grand per seat on their IT spend for security, like in even a regular company, not even like a super high security environment. They generally don't get really good results for that compared to what a truly mass market company gets just by virtue of not wanting to deal with customer support for lots of users. Like the best thing about Google is, the best and worst thing about Google is you can't get a hold of a person there. So they have to make sure their stuff mostly works 99.999% of the time. When it does not work, like when your account gets locked for some crazy reason, it is almost impossible to fix it if you don't actually know someone at Google. But most of the time it doesn't break. Whereas any enterprise piece of software, like any like $30,000 CAD package or whatever, is nowhere near as reliable as that. So there's that. And there's a lot of stuff where just people have economic self-interest in security now. Like it used to be, it'd be nice to have security, but you don't really benefit by having better security than somebody else. Now there is actual harm from stuff being hacked. Like the best example of it, like there's bug bounties and things like that, but bug bounties are honestly like a trivial amount of money relative to the loss in most cases, except in crypto, where you have this amazing principle of like there's an automatic bug bounty built into every cryptographic protocol that if you can hack it and you can somehow get the money, then you've got the money. So you can have 100% loss in a protocol. So they actually do care about security. And a lot of other people do care about security as well. There have been a lot of other things that are just sort of like technical improvements that happen because we have crazy machines now that can like be virtualized, and you can do all, there's so much extra resources for for doing fundamentally the same tasks that we were doing like 20 or 30 years ago, that you can build a lot of other technology on top of them to do cool stuff. But unfortunately, like corporations and freedom have sort of different models of what they care about from a security perspective. And there's some overlap and some benefit, but they're not entirely the same, and they don't necessarily solve all the problems. Because it's nice if the people who have the $30,000 a seat budget are fixing all your problems for you because you just wait a year and it'll fix. But unfortunately, they're not solving those problems. The biggest issues in like corporate enterprise security are definitely things that are inherent to scale. So you've got lots of machines, you need to make sure all of them are kept up to date. You've got lots of users, you don't necessarily know every single personal user. And like I've worked in more the product development side of security, more so than the managing security for an organization most of my career. And fairly recently, like the last couple of years, I've done some like side gigs where I'm doing security for some organizations just because I like them. And it's so interesting to see how painful it is to do sort of like these basic tasks that you sort of hand wave away, like just like managing users and things like that, even with like 30 users is a huge pain. So things like that, there's a lot of tooling that's been built around that. We've basically gotten to the point where rather than a separate login for every user on every system, mostly it was probably around 5 or 10 years ago, there's now like a single sign-on service, so you could have a central point of management for your users and then have people log in there. And we had Kerberos in honestly the 80s, but no one outside of academia really used Kerberos. Apple used Kerberos, which was kind of cool, but Kerberos was not a widely used tool. A lot of single sign-on was not used. LDAP did not cover web services, so there's a lot of stuff like that. But that exists, and then there's also people just sort of believe that there's defense in depth, like that defense in depth is a concept. Defense in depth has been a military concept for a long time. You never assume that like a single trench is going to hold back the entire foreign military, but you assume that it's an element that will slow things down. That has become something that computer security has adopted over the past probably 15 years, where instead of just having this like really hard shell of like a great firewall and network monitoring, and then all your systems inside are like 15-year-old unpatched systems, now you believe that people are going to get inside, they might have a real user, things like that, and they'll use different mechanisms to detect users once they're bad people, once they're already inside the system, and mitigate the harm they can cause. So there's stuff like that. Also, corporations, especially in crypto, are increasingly concerned about insider attacks, especially that North Korea vector is increasing an obvious problem. It gets really uncomfortable in a meeting to bring up, because people in a startup, they trust each other. Like people in startups will work probably like 80, 100-hour weeks sometimes. You all like get along and you're all mostly working for the same goal. If you're not working for the same goal, you're working for like some of the same goals, and you might just have different, like some people might think a better UX is more important than like faster performance, things like that. But you're like roughly going all in the same way and you mostly get along. When you start to think of it as some of these people are actual adversaries inside your organization, it's very toxic to the organization. People become very suspicious. And one of the military principles of like stuff is compartmentalization. So you basically, if somebody is involved in like shipping out orders, they should not necessarily have access to source code for the system and things like that. However, every startup, one of the principles is you share all this information as widely as possible internally, because somebody from the product team, especially who is closest to the users, somebody from customer support, is very likely to see what the actual problems are that users are facing. And one of the engineers might be helping out that person on some other task and say, oh, this is a problem, I can fix it in like one line of code. And they fix it and they fix product. That does not happen in high security government structured like principle of separation environments. So there's things like that. And unfortunately, those are sort of the things that keep the corporate world from being as likely to fix the problems that we all have, that we identify when we're trying to build high security applications. So those are much more specific and in some cases actually adversarial to the enterprise environment. I'd say the number one thing is gatekeeping, or as the company would probably call it, having a moat. If you have a single point of control, if you're, say, a large phone vendor that runs an app store, that every single person building an app for that app store has to submit code and submit Dun & Bradstreet number, corporate information, everything else just to get stuff in the store, and then they charge a 30% tax on that thing, there's a lot of consequences of that. One, anybody who's like an individual developer who's not willing to put their name on it is going to have a hard time building stuff. It has a high friction environment and everything else. But a lot of other problems of then every VPN that's running in the Apple App Store, for instance, or the Google Play Store, or any other app store, is all, there's like a single point where if the government goes to that app store and says, take these apps out of the app store in our country, they have to comply. Like Apple cannot just tell Brazil, like, no, we're gonna keep these things in the app store. So by forcing everyone through a store like this and not allowing sideloading of applications, you allow other people to do things that you don't want to have happen. Like the end user absolutely wants to use the VPN. Apple probably definitely wants them to have a VPN, but the government of some country might not want them to have a VPN. So it gives them a very good place to like choke on things. And then companies just in general are like tools of the state. Like it's hard to tell, like a bank is probably maybe 70% of the employees at banks are in some way like a government agent. They're doing compliance, they're doing all sorts of risk management stuff, mostly not for stealing money from the bank, it's for preventing people from doing stuff against some other regulation. So all sorts of this stuff happens, and that stuff is kind of annoying, and like a game company probably does not have that many people like in HR, but not anything else. But banks, communications companies, everyone else, these are all pretty heavily regulated industries that are largely focused on preventing their customers from doing what their customers want to do. So there's that. And then there's the problem that all this nice hardware out there, often it's not just hardware. You have to have firmware and other stuff to support it. And it's very reasonable if you're a hardware manufacturer that spends a lot of time on building a new piece of hardware that does something amazing. Say like a great graphics card that is an amazing graphics card. If you publish the source code, the specs for your card and the source code for your driver and everything else, your competitors can look at that and they can take that, and it's a good leg up for building their version of this stuff, especially if it's a marketplace where there's 2 or 3 big companies that are doing this kind of stuff. And unfortunately, as a result, they don't like to give out source code for their drivers, so they often give out a binary blob. But the problem with a binary blob is you can't really inspect what it does. And it's not so bad if it's a binary blob running on something that's nicely sandboxed, so all it's doing is like putting, if it was like a, I don't know, like a printer or something like that, there's not a whole lot that the printer can really do to screw you, except maybe it can store every image that's ever been printed on that printer, or it can put a special pattern of images or like little dots on the print to show which printer printed which thing, which is also done, the Euro constellation. So they can do bad things, but like the scope of the bad things it can do is somewhat limited. the scope of what your graphics card can do or what your memory controller can do is pretty unlimited, and those are things that have binary blobs in them. And then I'd say the biggest problem, well, I don't know, these are hard to rank, but like one of the other really big problems is third-party doctrine. Like as everything is moved to cloud, if it's a server that I control, that's in my house, especially in the US and in most countries around the world, you have pretty strong legal protections for search and seizure of that server. In practice, at the very least, they have to physically come in and do it, which is not something they can do at scale. Like even in a country where nobody has firearms, where nobody really does anything, it takes sending a person out to go do it. Like they can't say like, mail me your server. You have to go physically out and do it. So they can do this to targets, they can't do it as a fishing expedition. And in the US, one, it would require a warrant versus everything else. So it's a pretty high bar. And two, there's a lot of people who are not so compliant when people show up at their house to extract something like that. So you're probably not going to flush a server down the toilet, but all sorts of other bad stuff is going to happen. So there's that. But as all of this is, as also these services are moving to cloud-based services where a third party is actually hosting the data, hosting the application, you don't have that measure. You don't even know if somebody is trying to request your data from that cloud provider. If they have a gag order on their request, that order can happen. You might have no way to challenge it. You might not even know what's going on. And especially if it's a consumer service where they're making like $1 per user per year on this service, they have no incentive to really push back on it. So third-party doctrine and the adoption of cloud-based services for all sorts of stuff are a major problem. As we saw recently with the Telegram situation, if you run a centralized chat service that basically has decent transport security, well, maybe has decent transport security. I've certainly seen the protocol problems with some of that stuff, but let's take it as a given that they had okay transport security. It's still got unencrypted contents sitting there on a server. So there's a whole lot of bad stuff that can happen once that's turned over, and we saw the bad stuff happen. So there's that. And so there's these things. Software blobs are one thing, but then there's hardware blobs. Like you don't necessarily know how a piece of hardware works. You don't know the design of this piece of hardware that somebody sells you. You don't know that the specific piece of hardware that I have received is the same one that everyone else has received. With software, you can hash software pretty easily, so you can mostly identify a specific file if you're in an environment where you can run a hash and where you are confident that the thing that you just hashed is the thing that you're running, which goes in the whole like reproducible builds, inspecting the source code, and being in an environment where you can actually test the hashes. That's one whole area, but with hardware, you don't have that. Like with hardware, you need to do a physical inspection of the hardware, or you need to be there's two ways to do hardware. You either are assured of the provenance of where it was produced, and you trust the process, and you trust the plan, which is probably not a great plan, but you trust that it came from a good source and was well produced and everything else, or you inspect it. And to do inspection is destructive in most cases to do really well. And even then, it's really, really hard to do. Like it's beyond most end users' ability to do even a gross physical inspection of something. That's why ATM skimmers and things like that are a thing. But doing like a board level analysis is not automated in any sort of system that people widely do. Like my disposable laptop company, we actually like x-rayed the laptops as they came back, which is pretty fun because I used to work in radiology. But like this is not something that your average person is going to do. Although you can buy x-ray machines on eBay really cheap. But there's really no good way to know how secure a given piece of hardware is. There's no good way to know that this hardware matches a design because you're not given schematics in the first place for it, and you don't know that your instance of the hardware is the same as anyone else's. And as we saw with the pager situation, like a battery with 30 layers of like lithium ion whatever material, and a battery has 29 plus one layer of PETN, look pretty much the same from an external physical package. So I think even if they'd torn down the physical pagers and looked at them, you would not have really seen this problem. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. So you could conceivably have built a pager that was purely not that, but yes. I heard copper plate, I heard, but yeah. Okay. But you would have a hard time inspecting physical hardware to tell if it's good or bad. People do this. They do this on competitor products all the time. There's a whole like science of your own product. Like it just as I said earlier, it's hard enough to know if your device is working or not if you're just doing non-security stuff. It's hard to know if this chip that you just manufactured actually works or not. There's a whole like test and verification thing, and you would want to do test and verification on both your own hardware and on other people's hardware, and that's the same science that's used to do full in-depth teardown at the chip level. That is like fuming nitric acid. There are hobbyists like Travis Goodspeed that do this as a hobby in their house. I'm glad I am not his neighbor. He's awesome, but I am glad I did not live next to him. And this stuff is crazy. So there's that. And then there's just two other really big things. There's one, like, who owns your phone? Like, if you have a phone that runs, that your company provides, that's probably the company's phone, it's not your phone. And what if you use it to take a photo? Like, who owns data on who owns a device? What if it's your device, but it's running company data in a thing? There's this whole thing about like mobile device management. You don't really, and often people that work at companies end up not always working at that, like they don't spend their entire life working at that company, and sometimes the transition from being an employee to not an employee is not a mutually agreed, like it's a somewhat adversarial process. So like wiping someone's phone because you just fired them when that phone contains like the only voice recording of their like deceased relative or something like that was a case in California. These are things that happen, and they're like ambiguous legal situations. So there's that. And then the biggest problem that I have with almost all the security stuff is it's really hard to, it's like there's no legibility. It's really hard to understand what security assumptions you are making, because you are definitely making security assumptions. They may not be explicit security assumptions, but your assumption is like this computer in front of me contains like so many, if you go to your average user of a computer and you say like, where is your file stored? And you give them a computer, they're gonna like point at the phone, even if it's like a cloud service or something like that. So they're not really aware of what's going on behind the scenes. It's all kind of magic to them. And even if you are relatively technically sophisticated, I know people that are currently sitting in jail because they had files that were on iCloud that they did not intend to have on iCloud. So because they stored them on their desktop, and Apple helpfully put them in iCloud. So things like that. So things like that where it's not really clear what the security assumptions are that you should be making and whether they maintain as true over time are really hard to reason about. And a lot of stuff is making that harder. Like right now, if you run like the Signal app on your phone, it keeps a context database that is largely its own context database. It doesn't go into the system if you don't have it set up that way. But now you have Apple AI search and intents on Google and all sorts of other stuff. So like how deep into each application do you go? Where does the search happen? What results come from it? So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that that is just not clear to you as a user how your applications are actually working. So those are the things that I think are the bigger problems for people building like pro-freedom applications or using it in a non-corporate context. So yes, definitely interesting to think about these things. I think there's a lot of stuff that will be better. I mean, just like those things that got better over 15 years, they probably will get better in the future again, but it's hard to tell, and I like to be optimistic, but I think the threats also evolve, and yeah. Cool, but thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. Yes.
I have a question regarding stuff like Intel ME, and it basically provides ring -1 access. Yep. So it all sounds good, the improvement with the security approach and technologies, but if you have a government that has access to this kind of technology, then it nullifies everything that you told us about the improvements. I mean, this technology, I mean, do you believe that this is something that it's basically like a quantum computer of today for...
Well, it's a universal backdoor, yeah.
Yeah, it's a universal backdoor, and that's something that is most concerning for me.
Yes.
That everyone here runs hardware like, okay, there are some exceptions, but you have like laptops with Intel and AMD chips that run complete operating systems embedded in the dies. I also wanted to ask you a question about warrant canaries. Is this something that is actually is it working? This is a viable solution? I've heard some controversial opinion about this. Yeah. And yeah, I forgot about the third question. I think it.
I will answer the warrant canary first. I'm not a lawyer, so not legal advice. I have seen a lot of people put them in things like transparency reports that are like public companies that announce them, it seems to work pretty well there. They still would not necessarily protect you. Like, I've seen them go wrong just for stupid reasons, like, oh, we actually legitimately forgot to update the work canary and things like that. So they can cause false positives. They seem to have some moderate benefit in, say, large public, generally well-respected companies doing transparency report kind of stuff. I'd say the Cloudflare one is a pretty good example. I was there when that was added. The Google one was reasonable. The problem is it's probably more useful, the numbers. Big organizations like, say, Facebook, Google, like social media networks, get so many requests that it's actually interesting to see, not we haven't received any requests, but like how many we received. And it would be nice if they would progress to doing like more granular kind of things, because there probably are things where you do want to know, like I'm mostly okay with a warrant-based access to a single Facebook user's account that was involved in a crime if it was sufficiently documented. I would like that to be documented in public after the fact and things like that. The thing I'm not okay with is like blanket phishing expeditions for people that are not criminals and unmonitored access. And I haven't seen that the warrant canary process has been particularly useful in preventing that kind of stuff. And it also has not been super, if you believe access would come through means other than legal means, then it obviously wouldn't apply at all. The first question about Intel ME. ME is management engine is terrifying. I think the long-term solution there, and that has already sort of started to happen in the cryptocurrency world, is dedicated hardware devices for super high security tasks. Like, I can use a relatively non-secure x86 laptop with a high security external key management device, like there's multiple of these. And the worst things that are likely to happen to me are denial of service, essentially, against, I'm not gonna lose my key. I might sign the wrong thing if I don't properly validate. So there are ways to solve this. And as the quality of computing, there's like a floor of what's needed to do useful tasks. That floor was very close to the state of the art like 20 years ago. I know people who are like super tech people who use 10-year-old laptops totally comfortably now. It is now possible that you can use older and older hardware or lower spec hardware. So we are getting close to the point where there are projects like the Solana phone, the Saga and the Seeker, like people can build for small communities dedicated hardware devices that are relatively high security, or at least that are a different design, that are published and everything else, that are actually useful for those small communities. So that is probably the long-term solution. I don't have that much faith in like lobbying to get Intel to take ME out for most consumer stuff. I could see it becoming a thing for corporate environments where it needs to be, like, the idea behind ME is not actually bad. Like, being able to manage their computer remotely is actually a good thing for large deployments. The problem is it's not done in a trustworthy sort of way. And trustworthy in the context of the person who actually owns the computer and is using the computer, not the government or the Intel. So maybe they can fix that, and maybe it could become a requirement at some point. I don't think most users of most computers are the target of Intel ME shenanigans. I think they're just incidental like bycatch. So the harm caused by discouraging these people from using this stuff is so great relative to the benefit that there maybe is a solution like within the commercial world of like a special non-ME corporate version, but you absolutely don't want to be buying the computer that is the super high security computer that doesn't have any spying involved in it from notspy.com crypto AG, because once you're buying something that's not like the commodity device, then you become a target just by virtue of that. So it would need to become a sort of a mass market thing.
I have a question. I like the distinction that you made between like targeted attack and mass surveillance. These are two things, and I often get asked this question, you know, how do I protect myself against Pegasus, and I should use graphene and all these things. And I'm like, okay, first don't use the Gmail account. That will help with the surveillance that actually everyone is target of. And then maybe you think if you are a target of Pegasus or something like that. So out of all the things that you like, how would you recommend thinking about this? You know, I probably don't have to worry about some super hardcore low-level stuff like binary blobs, because probably not used for mass surveillance, and how to differentiate because these are completely different targets for personal.
Yeah, the part of the problem of all this stuff is you don't actually have any data on the attacks that are done that are not public. Like the only attacks that you really have good information about are things that are done either badly and they get caught, or they're done in a law enforcement context where they get used in court and then testified about, or are so old that they somehow become public. Like the crypto AG story is pretty much public, and the Glomar Explorer and stuff, but like that is decades ago.
Also on the mass scale, like
Yeah.
when that's usually what's discovered. That's why it doesn't make sense to use these targeted things again, messes, because then people will.
Yeah, we had like the DRB DNG, the RSA bad random number generator thing was probably the biggest mass scale. Probably, I believe it was a backdoor that was inserted, but who knows? But it was a mass scale attack, and that was well documented after the fact, and that is terrifying, and it shows that creating a nobody but us vulnerability, which is the term that NSA uses for that kind of stuff, is something they have historically probably been willing to do. So it is a reasonable risk. It does definitely come down to what is your threat model as an individual. The problem is, statistically, yes, you're probably not targeted specifically, but there are people who are like incidental or instrumental to getting to somebody else that become targets. Like the secretary at a shipping company is not targeted because the person's like personal life. They're targeted because they have access to somebody else's schedule, which then has access to some other stuff. So a lot of people are not aware that they are targets, but they are targets for things. It's still not a large number of people, but a large number of the people who are targeted are probably not the direct target. They're probably the incidental context there. And the other thing that terrifies me is the bar for actually being a target. Like the cost of doing these attacks, if it's a one-off dedicated targeted attack, is incredibly high. But now, like the pig butchering thing is probably the best example of a tailored attack on individuals that is very consequential for them. Like I know people that have lost like $3 or $4 million because they embezzled money from, they fell for one of these stupid pig butchering things. They embezzled money from their employer, as a public company, and sent it to this, and then got caught and then prosecuted for it and everything else. So like people are targeted with relatively sophisticated means for purely economic reasons, and the cost of doing those attacks is falling, and they don't need to be as targeted if they're cheap to do. So yes, it was probably very valid 20 years ago to say that if you weren't specifically a target, you're not likely to be a target of certain means, but the cost of those means is falling, and the number of people being targeted for it is increasing. Yes. And AI and everything else, yes. Yep. Yep.
Anyone else? Right. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.
And